Hello everyone. This series was written by the very talented Elias Witherow. You may recognize some of his other stories on my channel, such as Feed the Pig, We Should All Fear the Old Horns, Have You Ever Heard of a Chrome Sunset, Beyond the Blackout, A Body of Black and Gold, Something Awful Arrived with the Rain, Depression, That Dark Hole, and various other stories. He's definitely one of my favorite writers, and also, he's someone that I would call a very good friend, as he has gone out of his way in the past to show me generosity that no one else has when I had very little to give in return. And lately he's been having a rough time. So if you enjoyed this story, or any of the other stories by him that I've narrated, I ask you to go to his Reddit page and just show him some support by letting him know what you think of his stories, because I know he could really use it right now. He also has a new book out, which I'll link to in the description. I normally don't ask you guys to go too far out of your way to do things because I don't want to be an inconvenience, but I feel like showing him some extra support could mean the world to him right now, and it really only takes a moment of each of our day. I appreciate you taking the time to watch this video. I hope you enjoy my narration and the music that I composed for it. And if you do, be sure to like and share the video, and leave a comment letting me know what you thought. And with that said, enjoy the video.
My name is Matt, and my childhood wasn't normal, not by any stretch of the word. Something happened to my family that is almost impossible to understand, but I'm going to try my best to explain those 5 years. 5 years of my life I spent in terror. 5 years we all lived in fear. 5 years we'll never get back. My father, Spence, wasn't a very strong man, both physically and mentally. He was the type of dad who often let our mother speak for both of them. Now, he wasn't a complete pushover, but he often was content to just go with the flow rather than alter it. He worked hard and dedicated his free time to us, his family. He made sure our needs were taken care of. His soft assurances, the unseen foundation of our family. My mother, Megan, was the head of our house. She was outspoken, independent, and extremely loyal to all of us. She loved my father's quiet ways, and even from a young age, I could see the chemistry flowing strong between them. My little sister, Stephanie, was a year younger than I. She looked up to me, and my father always told me that it was my responsibility to look after her. And even though I gave her all kinds of brotherly hardship, I did love her. We lived in a suburban middle-class community, a complete stock photo of the American dream. My father worked a respectable 9-to-5 job, while my mother taught yoga classes out of the house. It was a neat life, organized and structured. Everything was discussed, considered, and acted upon as a family. It was a good home to grow up in. That was before he showed up. That was before the third parent. July 1989. I was sitting at the dinner table, waiting for my father to finish cooking. It was his turn tonight, and my stomach roared for his rosemary chicken. My sister, Stephanie, lay on her stomach in the living room coloring. Her golden blonde hair fell across her shoulders in waves, and she looked up at me, smiling. She extended what she had been working on, and I nodded, completely unimpressed. She sniffed at me and continued her sketch. My mother walked into the kitchen, pulling her hair back from her freshly showered face. "Everyone gone?" my father asked from the stove. My mother nodded. "Yes, Spence. The house is ours again. It's so much better teaching yoga in the basement. So much cooler. I'm glad we finished the basement over the winter. My clients are relieved as well. It's a scorcher out there today." "Mom, can you sit down so we can eat?" I begged from my spot at the table. My mother turned to me and laughed. "Matt, the hungriest 6-year-old this side of the Mississippi. Why don't you ask your dad to hurry up? He's the one cooking." I placed my forehead on the table's lid. "Dad, I'm going to die." Stephanie looked up from her coloring book. "Matt, don't be crazy." "You're crazy," I muttered, not looking back. "Nuh-uh," she said, sticking her tongue out at me. All right, my father said, turning from the stove. In his hands, he held a steaming platter of chicken. "Come sit down, Steph. The food's ready," I ordered my sister, the sight of the seasoned meat causing me to salivate. As she pulled herself up from the floor, my mother taking a place beside me. We all froze as someone knocked on the front door. My mother and father exchanged puzzled looks. My dad placed the food on the table and told us all to hold on a minute. Groaning, I watched him walk to the front door. He peeked through the keyhole. I saw him visibly tense, his whole body cementing like a statue. "Spence, who is it?" my mother asked. My father slowly turned back around to us, all blood draining from his face. His eyes were wide, and I saw fear dilate his pupils. He licked his lips and shot Stephanie and I a look. "Spence?" my mom pressed, her face contorting with concern. "No. This can't happen. Not again," I heard my father whisper, staring off into the middle distance. The door shook as another series of knocks echoed throughout the house. My mom stood, her voice cracking with contagious fear. "Spence, who is it? What's going on?" "I'm so sorry," my father mumbled, clutching his stomach, his face a pale sheet. "I have to let him in." Before any of us could say anything, my dad turned and opened the door. Dying sunlight blinded me, and I squinted to see who our unannounced visitor was.
"Hi, I'm Tommy Taffy. It's good to see you again, Spence."
I watched as my father slowly backed away from the open door. A man entered our house and shut the door behind him. My young mind tried to make sense of what I was seeing, but even at that young age, I knew something wasn't right with this unexpected guest. He was about 6 foot, and he had a shock of golden hair cut tight along his scalp. He wore khaki shorts and a t-shirt that said "Hi" in red cartoon font. But that wasn't what caught my eye. It was his skin. It was completely devoid of pores, a perfectly smooth, creamy texture that looked almost like soft plastic. His face was a pool of gentle pink, his mouth a cheerful cut along his cheeks, revealing a white strip of teeth. But they weren't teeth. It was just a smooth, edgeless row, like he had a mouthguard on. His nose was just a slight rise out of his face, like a doll, void of nostrils. And his eyes were twin puddles of sparkling blue, shining out at us from his flawless, eerie face. They were wide, like he was in a constant state of surprise, and they shifted around the room to look at us in a quick, jarring motion. His smile widened, and he raised a flawless hand to us at the table.
"Hi, I'm Tommy Taffy. It's good to meet you."
I noticed he didn't have any fingernails or skin defects, no wrinkles or bruises, nothing. It was like he was a living, talking, human-sized doll. "Spence?" my mother croaked, recognition blooming in her eyes. "It's going to be okay, Megan," my father said, voice shaking. "Let's just be polite to our new guest, okay?" The man, Tommy, cocked his head toward my father. My dad took a step back, raising his hands. "I mean our new friend." The frozen smile never left Tommy's molded face. There was no humor in his strange laugh. It sounded like he was clearing his throat or imitating a really bad chuckle. It was too pronounced, each syllable sounding too deliberate. My father forced a smile onto his face. I meant..." He looked desperately at my mother, who offered him no help, her body frozen in absolute fear. "I meant meet your new parent, kids." Stephanie, who was standing by her mother, frowned. "He's not our dad. You are. And why does he look so funny?" "Stephanie!" my mother hissed, gripping my sister's shoulder. Tommy laughed and walked forward to crouch in front of Stephanie.
"It's not nice to make fun of people who look different, is it?"
My sister looked at her feet, blushing. Tommy tasseled her hair.
"It's okay. Buck up, kiddo. We're going to get along just fine. I'm going to help your parents raise you. It's a big job being a mommy and daddy. Sometimes mommy and daddies need help."
Tommy turned to my parents, that ever-present plastic smile stretching his face.
"I helped their mommy and daddies raise them. Isn't that right, Spence?" "Megan."
Megan pulled Stephanie away as my father nodded nervously. That's right, kids. You did." Tommy smiled and turned to me. I was still sitting at the table, taking the odd scene in. I didn't understand what was happening. I didn't know who this weird-looking man was or what he wanted. What he was saying didn't make sense, but my parents seemed to know him, so I kept my speculations to myself.
And you must be Matt,
Tommy said, walking over to me. I didn't look at him, training my eyes to stare at my empty plate. I suddenly wasn't hungry anymore. I could feel the strange man beside me, his presence filling my head. I licked my lips, felt my heart begin to race. I didn't like this intruder. Something about him felt dangerous. Tommy walked behind me, chuckling, his hands sliding over my slender shoulders.
Oh, it looks like we have a shy one. That's okay. I'll help him with that,
he said to my parents. His fingers dug into my skin and I winced, but kept my mouth shut. Don't touch him, my mother hissed, eyes going wide. Tommy looked up at her, mouth stretched. My dad outstretched his hand, alarmed. Don't be so rude, Megan. Tommy continued to stare at my mother, who nervously lowered her eyes. Are you staying for dinner? Stephanie suddenly asked, breaking the tense silence. The eerie doll man let go of my shoulders, one of his hands sliding across my cheek and into my hair.
Oh, yes. I'll be here for quite a while.
And that was how Tommy Taffy entered our lives. At 6 years old, I didn't know any better than to seriously question what was happening. Their constant assurances that he was a friend pushed away any lingering doubt I had. As the days turned into weeks, I began to grow accustomed to Tommy's presence in our house. My initial fear slowly receded to wary caution. I soon learned that Tommy didn't like company. Whenever my mother had her yoga classes, Tommy would pull her off into a corner and whisper something to her. I would watch all of this with silent eyes. I would see my mother's face grow pale and she would nod, whispering back unknown assurances. Then Tommy would turn, that ever-present smile plastered on his face, and walk upstairs until the class was over. My parents told Stephanie and I that we weren't to talk about Tommy to our friends. Outside of the house, Tommy wasn't a part of our lives. I don't know why, but both my sister and I obeyed. Another thing I noticed was that Tommy never ate. He would sit at the table with us, but never partook in the meal. Stephanie asked him once if he was ever hungry, and Tommy just smiled at her silently and stroked her head. During the evenings, he would gather our family into the living room and give us a short lesson on how to be a good person. My parents never spoke during those talks, just sat next to us nodding. Tommy told us not to make fun of others, to love our friends and enemies, and always help those in need. He told us that's why he was here with us, to help my parents raise us, that we could come talk to him if we had a problem at school or didn't know how to handle certain situations. It went on like that for a month, and that's when my mother lost it. August 1989. My father had just arrived home from work, and I was sitting at the kitchen table doing homework. My mother was cooking dinner, and Stephanie was practicing her dance for the upcoming school play. She was going to be a ballerina and had 3 weeks to learn a few simple spins and twirls. She had been diligently practicing over the last few days, but just couldn't get it right. She was young, and her temper was getting the better of her. That's when Tommy decided to help her. He had been sitting on the couch watching her, when suddenly he rose and stood behind my sister, placing his hand gently over her shoulders.
Let me help, sweetie,
he cooed, his voice carrying a cheerful note. My mother spun around from the stove, and I saw her visibly tense. She didn't like Tommy touching us. She gripped the wooden spoon in her hand until her knuckles went white, watching as Tommy crouched and cupped Stephanie's body with his. He took her hands in his from behind and guided her arm and waist, his cheek pressed gently against my sister's. Tommy, let her learn on her own, my mother said, her voice shaking. Tommy didn't even look at her, just kept guiding my sister. I could hear my father coming down the stairs, freshly changed from a day at the office. Tommy spun my sister, and for the first time, she nailed the twirl, her little feet twisting her body in a complete circle. Tommy clapped his hands once and then leaned down and kissed Stephanie on the cheek.
Good girl.
Don't do that, my mother shrieked, dropping the spoon, her face draining of blood. I jumped in my seat at the table and swallowed hard. I don't know why my mom was getting so upset. He was just helping her. I also knew, deep down, that it was a bad idea to yell at the new member of our family. It was the gut instinct of a child, a gentle warning that rumbled in my head. Tommy stood. Unsure what to make of the confrontation. "Megan, what's wrong?" he asked. My mother's eyes never left Tommy. "Spence, I can't do this anymore. I can't keep pretending everything is all right. We know what this monster is. We know what he did to our town all those years ago. I want him out of our house." My father's eyes went wide, panic blooming his face. "Megan!" He licked his lips, eyes darting back and forth at all of us. "Don't be rude. Tommy has been a big help." My mom grit her teeth. "Stop that. Stop pretending we want him here. I can't watch this happen. I want him out." Very slowly, Tommy walked into the kitchen and stood in front of my mother. He looked down at her, his perfect blue eyes shining like crystal moons. His voice was like frozen silk.
"Megan, would you come down to the basement with me? I need to have a few words with you."
My mother took a step back. "Get away from me. Get away from my family. You're not welcome here anymore." She turned desperate eyes to my father. "Spence, do something." My dad raised his hands in a gesture of helplessness. I could see he was terrified. Stephanie was watching from the living room, her lip quivering, eyes watering. I suddenly wanted to go comfort her, but I felt glued to my chair.
"Come on now, Megan. Just a quick word."
"Fuck you!" my mother spat, and I gasped, heart dropping into my stomach. I'd never heard my mother swear before, and it scared me stiff. Suddenly, Tommy grabbed my mother by the back of the neck, the smile never leaving his face, and yanked her to the basement door. "Spence, stop him! Help me!" Helplessly trying to remove Tommy's iron grip from her, Tommy shot my dad a look that froze him where he stood. I'm sorry, Megan. We need to do what he says," he cried. Stephanie was now openly crying, hands at her sides, tears running down her face. I felt sick as I watched Tommy open the basement door and drag my mother down into the darkness. The door slammed closed behind them. It was silent for a few minutes. Then the screams began. I'd never heard my mother scream before, and the sound of it shattered me. My father ran into the kitchen, scooped me into his arms, and then snatched up Stephanie and the other one. He marched us upstairs into his bedroom and dumped us on the bed. We sat huddled like that for hours, none of us speaking a word. My mother continued to scream. Finally, long after the sun set, we heard the basement door open.
"Mom's sleeping in the basement tonight,"
Tommy called out. 2 years passed after that night. My mother never resisted or talked back to Tommy again. When she came out of the basement the following morning, I expected to see her covered in bruises and blood, but I could see no visible signs of violence. I was too young to understand what had happened, why my mother now walked with a limp and would for the rest of her life. She didn't speak to my father for a month, and even then it was just enough to get by. I noticed my father crying a lot during those 2 years. I didn't know what was happening to my family, but I kept my mouth shut and obeyed the rules. Listen to Tommy. Don't talk about Tommy to others. Things went calm during those 2 years. Tommy continued to give us life lessons and be a part of our home. No one but my family knew he was living with us. He was our secret, the dark star that hung above our heads. I learned to smile around Tommy, as did my sister. If he thought we were happy, he seemed more relaxed. But that night, my mother challenged him. That changed something. Every couple months, Tommy would assert his authority over my parents. He would test them, stretch the limits of their patience and nerves. Most of the time, my father and mother would just humbly submit to whatever mind game he had played with them. Most of the time, he would do or say something to Stephanie or myself. It always made me uncomfortable. Sometimes he would have us sit on his lap while he stroked our hair. Sometimes he'd sing strange songs to my sister about love. Sometimes he would make us take a bath together while he watched. I always put on a brave face during these times. Stephanie was young still, so she wasn't as bothered as I was. It was uncomfortable, and I would look to my parents for guidance. With pale faces, they'd nod silently, and I continued in whatever activity we were forced into doing. It was in the early part of 1991 when the next awful thing happened to my family. Tommy pushed the limits once again. I rubbed sleep from my eyes and looked at the race car clock on the wall. The glow in the dark hands read 2 a.m. I could hear something in the hallway outside my room. It sounded like someone crying. Where was Tommy? I checked the dark corners of my room to make sure he wasn't there, watching me sleep. When I was assured he wasn't, I pulled the covers away and slipped to the floor. I crept to my door and looked out into the darkness. I could see a figure sitting on the floor by my sister's closet door. A person. I squinted in the black and realized that it was my father, with his hands over his face. He was sobbing, his back against the wall. "Dad?" I whispered. My father looked up and immediately shooed me back into my room. I just stood there as my eyes adjusted to the night. My father's face was a mess of blood and bruises. "Go back to bed, Matt, please," he cried. I took a hesitant step out into the hallway. "Dad, what happened to your face? What's going on? Did Tommy do that?" My father's eyes went wide and he shushed me. No, of course not. Don't say such things. Tommy he's here to help us be a better family." I walked closer to my dad and froze as I passed my sister's door. I could hear muffled cries from inside. I could hear fear. "Dad," I whispered, pointing to the door. "What's wrong with Steph?" My dad wiped a trail of blood from his lips, eyes watering, anguish stretching his features. "Come here, Matt." I crawled into his outstretched arms as something loud banged against the wall from my sister's room. I could feel tears drip on my head as he fought back misery. "Tommy's in there, isn't he?" I said quietly. My dad sniffled. "Yes, son." I looked up into his bloody face. "What did you do, Dad?" My dad tried to smile, but his face wouldn't cooperate. "He wanted to do something with your sister I didn't like. I told him no." As he spoke, I realized I could hear my mother crying from the bedroom. My dad cupped his hand under my chin. "We can't say no to Tommy, okay? Remember that." My sister screamed from her bedroom, a shrill, piercing cry that shook me to my soul. I gripped my father's arms. "Why is he here?" I whispered. "Why can't he just go away?" My father was silent a moment. Then he lowered his mouth to my ear. "Listen to me, Matt. This is very important. When you grow up, do not have children. He follows those with children." I shifted in my father's arms as something was dragged across the hardwood floor from the other side of the wall. My father grit his teeth, more tears spilling. "We don't know who he is or what he is. He came to our town when we were little boys and girls, just like you and Stephanie. Your mother and I lived in 2 houses down from one another. Tommy infested our street. I don't know how. He was everywhere, always. He'd be at my house, but also across the street, also at your mother's, all at the same time. I don't know what he wants, what his purpose is. He just showed up one day. He just showed up and wouldn't go away. God knows my father tried." "Is that how Grandpa died?" I asked. I'd never met my grandpa. I just knew he died years before I was born. My father nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Tommy had to teach him a lesson. He had to teach the entire street a lesson. After that, why can't you just kill him?" I whispered, ever so softly. My dad brought his mouth closer to my ear, his voice barely audible. We tried everything. We burned him, shot him, cut him into pieces, but it never worked. He always came back, knocking at our door. And someone had to pay. Someone always had to pay. If we didn't follow his rules, someone had to pay. Tommy was our secret. He was our invisible monster hidden from the outside world. Deaths were covered up. Abuse was brushed under the rug because we knew if anyone said a word, Tommy would make it bad for whoever had to face his punishment. I digested all of this with the understanding of an 8-year-old, and the only thing I could think of was, when is he going away? My father kissed the top of my head. 3 more years. The bedroom door suddenly opened and my father jumped, tumbling me out of his arms. Tommy stood in the darkness, his face perfectly composed except he was breathing hard. His plastic-looking face scared me, his 2 blue eyes glowing out of the black. Tommy jabbed a thumb over his shoulder at the now silent bedroom.
She's going to sleep like a log tonight.
September 1993. We had 1 year left. 1 more year. I could almost see the desperation in my parents' eyes grow every day, begging the calendar to advance. We were almost through the nightmare. I thought a lot about what my father had told me that horrible night in the hallway. I thought about what he must have gone through as a child, what he must have experienced. I wondered how bad things must have gotten for Tommy to murder my grandfather. I realize now that despite all the awful things Tommy was doing, my father's submission was keeping us alive. His agonized silence kept Tommy's wrath at bay. Looking back, I can't imagine the mental torture he endured during those 5 years. Stephanie didn't talk much after that night in March. I noticed her charismatic personality decline drastically, and suddenly she was an unsmiling, silent child. I don't think she understood what happened to her, and as she grew up, I think her mind slowly began to build a wall, blocking that night out of her mind's eye. My mother and father seemed to be extra compliant that last year. They engaged in Tommy's nighttime lessons with added enthusiasm, and my mother desperately made sure Stephanie and I reacted in ways that made Tommy happy. But I didn't make it out unscathed. Tommy was sure to make his mark on our entire family. I was sitting in my room with the door closed. It was almost dinner time, and everyone was downstairs getting ready. I could hear Tommy laughing from the living room. I looked down at the magazine one of my friends at school had given me. It was a Playboy. We had pored over the pages in school, giggling and ogling over naked women scattered throughout the magazine. I'd never seen anything like it. It was my first exposure to that world. It made my heart race in ways I enjoyed and felt something weird but pleasurable stirring inside me. I had asked my friends if I could borrow the magazine, and he had let me. I adjusted myself on the bed and pored over the nude photos. I couldn't believe women actually let people take pictures of them like this. I felt something stir in my crotch as I turned another page. My heart was racing. I felt hot, my cheeks flush. I was on the last page when I heard something from the doorway. "What you got there, Matt?" I whipped my head up, jumping, the magazine falling to the floor. Tommy was watching me from the door. I hadn't even heard him open it. "Nothing," I mumbled, snatching the Playboy up and shoving it under my pillow. Tommy walked over to me. "I didn't hear you come in," I mumbled, blushing. Tommy reached over my pillow and pulled out the magazine. "It's not nice to lie. I've told you that. Why were you lying to me, Matt?" I swallowed hard, heart thundering against my ribcage. I'm sorry, I trailed off miserably as Tommy thumbed through the pages. He glanced down at me. "Do you like this?" I knew I couldn't lie to him again. I nodded, my skin flush, eyes on the floor. Tommy smiled and sat down next to me on the bed, one hand resting on my thigh. "Do these pictures make you feel good?" I didn't look at him as I nodded again. Suddenly, Tommy slid his hand over my crotch and gave it a gentle squeeze. "Does it make your penis feel good, Matt?" I jumped, his touch scaring me. He removed his hand and chuckled, his strip of seamless teeth sparkling. Tommy put the magazine down and cupped his hand under my chin. "Do you know how to masturbate, Matt? Has your father told you how to do that?" My breath came in short gasps, his hand cool and smooth against my face. I didn't know what he was talking about. I didn't know what he wanted me to say. I just stared at him with helpless eyes. Tommy sighed. "It's probably best that he hasn't. It's a sensitive discussion. I feel like I should have it with you, not him. You're what, 10 now?" I nodded, paralyzed. Tommy slowly reached down and grasped my crotch again. "Do you want me to show you how to do it?" I squirmed under his grip. "No, thank you, Tommy." Tommy smiled gently. "It's okay to be scared. Growing up is scary. You're going to be such a handsome young man." He stroked my cheek with his other hand, one on my cheek, the other still grasping my crotch. "Have you had your first kiss yet?" "Tommy, please," I cried, feeling tears begin to form in my eyes. Tommy pushed me back on the bed. I was now staring up at him as he cupped my head in his hand. "You don't have to be afraid of growing up, Tommy. There's a lot of good things to look forward to, and just think, when you have children, I'll come help you raise them. It's going to be fun." Let me go," I whispered, openly crying now, his breath hot on my face. Tommy suddenly leaned down and kissed me, his lips engulfing mine. I let out a squeal of panic as I felt his tongue slide into my mouth, his grip tightening around my crotch. His mouth tasted of rotting fruit and decaying meat, a rush of filth that invaded my taste buds. He rolled his lips around mine and then pulled away and whispered, "Not going to get hard for me." I just cried, staring up at him with shocked, panicked eyes. Tommy smiled and whispered in my ear, "That's okay." He suddenly sat up, releasing me. "Come on, dinner's ready." Shaking, I wiped my face and let him help me off the bed. I wasn't hungry. July 1994. As the days marched closer and closer towards July, my family developed a silent optimism, a desperate plea to make this all stop, to make it all go away. My mother and father made sure there was no reason for another hard lesson. They bent over backwards for Tommy, begging through clamped teeth that we'd all make it to July without another incident. On July 3rd, we woke up to find Tommy Taffy was gone. 5 years to the day. We couldn't believe it. He'd simply vanished overnight. We checked our entire house, my mother weeping tears of relieved joy that the nightmare was finally over. After checking every inch of the house 3 times over, we met in the living room, embracing one another as a family. Tommy had moved on. The sentence was over. My father called out of work, and we went away for 2 weeks to the beach. During those 2 weeks, I kept expecting to wake up with Tommy standing over me, that horrific smile on his face, but he didn't. It was over. My parents did their best to rebuild our family, fill in the cracks that had been made during those long years, and I love them dearly for it, but some monsters just can't be forgotten. I don't know what Tommy Taffy was, or where he came from. I don't think I'll ever know. What was his purpose? Why did he do those awful things to us? I pore over the possible answers until my head splits and I find myself crying. The memory is too much to dig up. Some things are just left dead in the past. But I haven't forgotten what my father told me in the hallway that awful night outside my sister's room. I'm 33 now, and have remained unmarried and without children. I can't risk it, and I can't risk that monster coming back into my life. I've never understood why my parents chose to have kids. They both had been exposed to Tommy during their childhood, so why have Stephanie and I? Maybe they didn't believe he'd come back. But I believe it. And I'm terrified. Because you see, yesterday, my sister gave birth to twins.
Some of you may have read my son's account, The Third Parent, about what happened regarding the monster Tommy Taffy. After reading it, after crying over it, I felt compelled to write this. I'm not here to defend myself. I'm not here to make excuses. I did what I had to do so that my family would survive. I knew what Tommy was capable of. I knew that we'd have to endure it. But I also knew that if we could make it 5 years without pissing off Tommy Taffy, we'd come out of the nightmare alive. How did I know that? Well, because I had already lived it. I had already been exposed to what that thing was capable of. I'd seen Tommy's temper. I'd seen what pushed his buttons. I had already done my 5 years. Like I said, I'm not here to defend myself. What happened to my family is unspeakable, but we're alive. No. Instead, I'm writing this so that you can understand why I did what I did, why I chose to let Tommy do what he did to my wife and children. After you hear my side, after you hear what I went through, then you can judge me. Tommy first arrived on my street when I was 7. I was the only child and lived with both my parents in a middle-class neighborhood. It was a mellow slice of the American dream, like a cut of apple pie under a smothering layer of vanilla ice cream. My street was in a secluded residential neighborhood in the far corner of our sprawling development. There were 6 houses in total, and we were a tight-knit bunch, both the parents and the children. In the summer, we'd have cookouts, and in the winter, we'd have Christmas parties. It was almost like our block was one big family. Everyone looked out for one another. Everyone was generous and considerate. It was a different time.
when people trusted one another. But our picture-perfect life shattered when he arrived. Jesus, I'll never forget it. July 1969. I'd just gone to bed, my 7-year-old mind exploring my imagination, turning thought into dream. The moon was a warm slice of yellow in my window, an expanse of stars winking down at me as I drifted off to sleep. I could hear the TV on in the living room, a comforting reminder that my parents were still awake and the monsters under my bed would stay away tonight. That's when I bolted awake by a knock at the front door downstairs. It was such a sharp contrast to the comforting murmur of the TV that my mind went on full alert as the noise echoed into the house. I sat up in bed, irritated, clutching Growls, my teddy bear. I heard the heavy footsteps of my father walk to the door, probably expecting a neighbor. The familiar creak of the front door was followed by a muted murmur of conversation. I could hear my father's voice speaking, interrupted on occasion by another man I didn't recognize. My mother joined the conversation, and I could hear my father getting angry. Minutes stretched on as the mysterious late-night visitor continued to talk with my parents. I slid out of bed and went to my bedroom door, peeking my head out to listen. I still couldn't make out the words, but I could tell my father was getting furious. He started yelling, and I heard him demand the visitor leave our house, or he was calling the police. It got very quiet then. So quiet I couldn't hear my heart beating in my chest. Then I heard my mother begin to cry. It was soft, so soft, but it scared me. The nighttime visitor was saying something to my parents, his voice low. My mother continued to sob. After a moment, my father said something I couldn't make out. Immediately following, I heard something slam into the wall downstairs so hard the picture in the hallway crashed to the floor. I slapped my hand over my mouth to stifle a scream, heart racing. What was going on? My mother let out a pitiful noise. I could hear her pleading with someone. There was a scramble of feet and then another loud bang against the wall. The intruder was saying something to my parents, his voice oozing with authority. I strained to make out the words, but it came to me in a jumble of soft noise. After another couple of minutes of agonizing fear, I heard my father call down for me. My heart was a wild drumbeat in my chest, and I bit my lip, hands shaking. Why did he want me? What was happening? My father called again, his voice trembling slightly. Slowly, I pulled the door to my bedroom open and walked to the edge of the stairs. I realized I was clutching Growls, my teddy bear. My palms were sweaty, and I could feel the soft of his fur growing damp. I looked down the stairs to the door and I froze, my eyes going wide. My father was gripping his throat, wincing, tears in his eyes, something I'd never seen before. My mother had her arms wrapped around herself, moisture staining her cheeks. But that wasn't what captured my attention. There was a stranger standing next to my parents, staring up at me. He was in his early 30s and wore a white t-shirt that read, in red font, "Hi." His hair was blonde and cut short. His two blue eyes, pools of glowing brilliance set in a sea of snow. Then I noticed the oddities of this intruder. His skin was impossibly smooth, a clean pink sheen of absolute perfection. His nose wasn't so much a nose as it was a nub jutting out of his face. His lips were twisted in a smile, revealing white strips where his teeth should have been. "Hi, Spence," he called to me, his voice cheerful. "I'm Tommy Taffy. I'm going to be staying with you for a while." I clutched Growls to my chest, quivering, begging my parents for guidance. Instead, they cast their eyes to the floor, clearly shaken. I didn't know what was happening, what had been said between them, but I could feel danger in the air, thick and malicious. "Come down here so I can get a good look at you," Tommy said, waving me forward. My father's eyes suddenly met mine and I gulped. Even at that age, I could interpret the look he passed on to me. "Be careful, son." Cautiously, I walked down the stairs, never letting go of my bear. When I reached the foot of the stairs, my mother reached out for me, but Tommy stepped in front of her, smiling down at me. He squatted down and ruffled my hair. his immaculate skin looking almost polished and waxed at this proximity. "Cute fella, aren't you? Who's that you got?" he asked, gesturing to my bear. His name is Growls," I stammered. Tommy grinned. "Of course he is. I'm going to help your parents for a while, so I'd like the three of us to be friends. Me, you, and Growls. You think that'd be okay?" Again, I looked at my parents for help, confused and shaken. I had no idea what was going on, who this was, why my parents looked so scared. He seemed nice enough, but the way my father rubbed his throat told me otherwise. "Boop, boop," Tommy chuckled, knocking gently on my head. "Hey, I asked you a question, Spence." What did you do to my daddy?" I whispered, immediately wishing I hadn't. Tommy's mouth remained a frozen smile, but his eyes darkened, ever so slightly. My father reached out and grasped my shoulder. "Spence, son, it's okay. I'll tell you later about it. For now, Tommy is going to... He shot a look at my mother. He's going to stay with us." And that was the start of a 5-year stretch I can never forget. Through whispered inquiries, the Tommy Taffy had visited everyone on our street. He was in our home, but also in theirs. I learned this from my eventual wife, Megan, who lived across the street from me. She told me that some strange guy was living in their house. After she described him, I deduced that it was one and the same, Tommy Taffy. I didn't understand how it was possible, but knew to keep my mouth shut. Tommy had sworn me to secrecy. He swore everyone to secrecy. This was enforced by my parents, who told me in hushed whispers to never tell anyone about Tommy. I could tell everyone feared him. I did too. There was something unsettling about his constant smile, his slightly off features, and the cool, enunciated way he spoke and laughed. I didn't know what he told my parents to keep them from going to the police, why they were allowing him to live in our home, but it must have been terrible. We were a hostage in our own home. Of course, Tommy didn't keep us there, but we knew he would be waiting once we came back. At night, Tommy would sit us down and give us life lessons. He would tell us how to be good people, how to love one another. I remember one time during the first week, I looked out my front window across the street into Megan's living room. I saw Tommy there, speaking to her family on the couch. The Tommy in front of my family stopped speaking immediately and stared long and hard at me. Then he went to the window and closed the curtains before continuing. During the evenings, as the fathers of our street came home from work, I'd see them meet briefly in the road, muttering to each other, casting looks over their shoulders. There was a mutual terror shared between them, an unspoken knowledge that they had to keep Tommy's secret, that getting the police involved would only lead to, well, nothing good. I imagine upon arrival that Tommy threatened our family and then showed some sign of physical dominance over the men. I remember the banging against the walls and the way my father had gripped his throat. But what the hell had he said to them? Why did they allow him to infest our homes? Oh, a month later, I found out. They were plotting against Tommy. They were going to kill him. August 1969. Again, I was woken from slumber. I looked at my Spider-Man clock and saw that it was after midnight. I scrubbed sleep from my eyes, grasping in the dark for Growls. As I found my bear, I heard banging from downstairs along with several voices. I slipped out of bed and went to my door. The lights downstairs were off, but I saw beams of light cutting through the black. Flashlights? I called out for my parents, but saw their bedroom door was wide open. I knew they weren't in bed then. More voices from downstairs followed, along with the scraping across the hardwood floors. I jumped as a bang shook the night, and then the voices faded. Why were they going into the basement? I thought. Silently, assuming my parents were down there, I crept to the first floor, clutching growls to my chest. Sure enough, the basement door was open. I saw the light reflecting off the dusty floor. I could hear my father's voice, then familiar voices of the neighbors. They were speaking to someone. They were angry. My heart froze in my chest as someone laughed from the depths of the cellar. Making sure not to make a sound, I slunk to the open door and descended to the first 2 steps to look at the scene below me. Tommy was bound to a metal chair in the middle of the room, surrounded by the 6 pairs of parents that lived in our neighborhood. Their backs were to me, but I could see Tommy's flawless face gazing up at them. Megan's father was there, his face a mess of bruises and swollen flesh. His arm was in a sling, and it looked like his shoulders slumped like his back was in pain. I sucked in a breath and realized one of the men was passing my father a pistol. The woman stood by their husbands with grim looks on their faces. There was no disagreement among the executioners.
"It's time you leave our lives,"
one of the men said, looming over Tommy. I recognized him as my friend Luke's father. They lived 2 houses down.
"This is your last chance,"
he growled. Tommy didn't even struggle in his rope bindings, that ever-present smile still on his face. He looked up at them, the overhead light illuminating his sparkling blue eyes.
"I don't understand. I'm just trying to help all of you raise your children properly. I'm not going anywhere."
A look passed between the parents, then my father put the gun to Tommy's head.
"You're not helping anyone. You're a monster. You can't come into our lives and threaten our children, threaten our lives. That's not how this works. All those threats you whispered to us while we were caught off guard. Well, look at you now."
My father spat on him.
"Pathetic. And now you'll get yours."
My father shot him in the head. The report was deafening and I almost screamed, slamming my hand over my mouth at the last second. Tommy's head whipped back as the smell of gun smoke spiked the air. It was silent for a moment. And then... In horror, I watched as Tommy slowly raised his head to stare back at my father.
"What the hell?"
one of the women breathed, her voice shaking. There was no blood, no shatter of bone, nothing, just a dark circle in Tommy's forehead where the bullet had passed.
"What the fuck are you?"
someone whispered. Tommy's eyes spun to the man who had spoken.
"I'm Tommy Taffy, and I'm not going anywhere."